Namaskar. Welcome to Prakash on Basics. I am Prakash Zog and we've been talking of religions in this Indian subcontinent. After Jainism, in a span of about 100 years, comes the great development in the form of Buddhism. We must understand Buddhism by analyzing its major parts. How and why did Buddhism start? What are its main teachings? What is Pratitya Samutpad? What are Hinayan, Mahayan, Vajrayan? And how did it spread beyond the Indian subcontinent to more than about 7 to 8 different countries throughout Southeast Asia? And how it was out of India for some time and back in India again. So let's try and understand all this. Let me remind you that a few thousand years BC is the time when Vedic religion began to dominate the social, cultural, economic, religious thoughts processes throughout this area. It was the only major source of knowledge at that time. The original lofty ideas gradually gave way to selfish tendencies, to ritualisms, to sacrifices, and these started taking predominance. Let me remind you that dharma, karma, punarjanma, that is transmigration, ahimsa, pap, punya, atma, brahma, these were all major concepts in Vedic religion itself. Long before they were some of them were adopted either by Jainism or by Buddhism. With time, everything deteriorates. So these ideas had also deteriorated. They had to be looked into from a different perspective and a new way. Ritualism and yajna are not the only solutions to all possible problems of common man. The thinkers of Upanishads opposed all this. They came up with good solutions also, but their knowledge was beyond that of the common man, because it was said to be rahasya jnana, to be given only to the most knowledgeable. For a common man, the solution to his day-to-day problems was far more important than what happens in his next life. The greatest success of Buddhism was to address, identify these things, these problems, and provide easy possible solutions for a common man which were affordable. There is one more issue. Dharma in India is not religious as the religion that we talk of in the West. It's far more. It is the ideal way of living. And this concept of what is ideal was different in case of different religious leaders. Siddhartha Gautam started his religion with the same concept in mind. Like all other thinkers that I mentioned previously, the Ajivaks, the Shramans, the Mahavir himself, and many of the thinkers from the Upanishads, they all had their own concepts and ideas. Some of them later on developed into modified religions, as in case of Mahavir and Siddhartha Gautam. Siddhartha Gautam is a historical figure. So the information related to him is very precise and known to us from many different sources. Buddhist scriptures are there, but then there are Ashokan edicts like the one at Rukmandehi, and there are other areas and sculptures also from which information can be obtained. In his case, his birth date is also known. 563 BC is that time span, and many of his biographies are available. Unluckily, there are a lot of myths that have got attached along with them. So let us keep those myths aside. Ashwaghosh had written a Buddha Charit, that was 2nd century BC. The Lalit Vistara Sutra, which is of the Mahayana following, is from the 3rd century AD. The Abhinishkramana Sutra, the Mahavastu, the Nidan Katha by Buddha Ghosh, all these are from the 5th century AD. That's a long time after his passing away. And then there are so many Jataka stories. They all reflect on the biography to some extent or some areas of Gautam Buddha. Let us try and keep all those issues associated with myths aside and look at the historical facts. His time span is that of the Mahajanapada period, that is around 800 BC. That was the time when the socio-political structure was well established and stable in India. Rules of how a king should rule, what he should do, what are his duties, etc. were all very well known. Social structure was very well formed because of a lot of information that was already available through texts like the Atharva Veda. And so the kings ruled very effectively in India in a number of small principalities and small countries. Siddhartha's father was Shuddhodhan, the king of the Shakya Republic. He belonged to the Shakya clan. So Gautam Buddha is also many times referred to as Shakya Muni, the sage of the Shakyas. His mother Mahamaya was also a Shakya. Shakyas are more or less like the Kshatriyas. Shuddhodhan was the king of Kapilavastu, which was the capital of his small principality. It is said that Mahamaya, his mother, dreamt of Airavata, the white elephant of Indra, which was an auspicious sign when she was pregnant. When she was traveling to her parents, on the way she gave birth to Siddhartha in Lumbini Van, a small forest like area just outside one of the small towns. This was on Vaishakha Purnima, a specific date in the Indian calendar. Her health was not really very good. She had some medical problems, and 6 days after childbirth she passed away. The child Siddhartha was then cared for by her sister Prajapati Gautami, and so later on he was known as Gautama, the one who was looked after by Gautami. It is a very common practice to accept mother's name, here in this case of Gautami, and so he is known as Siddhartha Gautam. As it was a practice in most of the kingdoms, the royal astrologer was called to find out what is going to happen to this child in future. He predicted that the child would either become a Chakravarti, that is an emperor, or could be exposed to the truth of life and leave home as a sannyasi and later on become a great sage. The father was naturally worried, and so he shielded the child from all exposure to the outside world. He remained within his palace, away from all sorrows and misery. He was married to Yashodhara at the age of 16 and had a son called Rahul. He remained shielded till he was 29. That's a grown-up age, mature person. The other option, as I mentioned, was to become a Chakravarti. So it must have been quite likely that he was educated very well by his father and correspondingly by the gurus that he must have had, and trained to become a very good emperor. So he knew all rules and regulations, and the knowledge available there and then was only the Vedic knowledge. So he must have been educated in all the ideas in Vedas also. At the age of 29, with his charioteer Channa, he stepped out of his palace and walked and moved around in the city. It is here that he was first exposed to three human situations: Jara, Vyadhi and Mrityu. Jara is old age. That is when he saw a very old person, something totally unknown to him because there was no one like that in his palace. And he was told that that's what is going to happen to everyone sometime or the other. And then he saw an extremely sick person. This is Vyadhi. And this, he was told, is a part and parcel of life of a common man. Sometime or the other you tend to fall sick and you undergo a lot of suffering. And then he saw some people carrying a person on their shoulders, taking away, crying and weeping, for the person was dead. And that is Mrityu. And that was something that he had never been exposed to. The sights were totally unknown to him. It is quite likely that he must have read or heard about all this. But the first exposure was a big shock. It is said that he also saw a sannyasi who was said to be moving around trying to find answers to many problems. When he returned, it was a big shock to him of what he had seen. He realized that the problems in the true world outside were completely different from what he was living, where he was living and what he had been seeing around himself. As a prince, it was his responsibility to find a solution to all this. Had he been like a common person or an illiterate person, he would not have bothered and would have forgotten all this. But he seemed to be an extremely responsible person. And so, he decided that it was time to move out and find a solution, to become a sannyasi, to give up everything in life. And so at night he quietly left his palace for the forest. This is an important event in Buddhism and is known as Mahabhinishkramana. He is moving out, the moving out of the Great One. Initially he had two gurus, Alar Kalam and Rudrak Ramaputra. They were both sannyasis, ascetics, and as it was common practice then, sannyasis usually follow the Sankhya and the Yoga philosophy or the darshanas. With strict penance, a strict set of rules for meditation are expected. Gautam Buddha somehow did not get along with his two teachers and probably a few more co-students who were there, maybe around 5 of them. And so in due course of time they parted ways. He then went into strict meditation, starved himself and lost a lot of weight, and that's the statue that is often seen at so many different places where you can only see his bones and meditating. It is at this stage that he came across a woman called Sujata, who reminded him that if you don't eat food, what is the use of you getting your knowledge? You are going to die anyway. So the knowledge that you gain will be of no use to anyone. So there is no point of you in you going to such extremes of meditation. Gautam Buddha realized this, accepted food from her and gave up his extreme behavior. And that is reflected even later on, because he followed what is the Madhyama Marga, the median path away from the extremes. He is said to have contemplated, meditated for a span of around 49 days after that. Total span being around 6 years from the time that he had left home. And then in Gaya under a banyan tree at the age of 35, he received Bodh or Bodhi as it is said, total knowledge. So the place is now known as Bodh Gaya, and the tree is known as the Bodhi Vruksha or the Bodhi tree, the tree under which Gautam Buddha got his knowledge. Please realize that Gautam Buddha did not believe in God. So we can logically interpret what must have happened. He must have followed the typical pattern of what is known as Nididhyasan, dedicated, determined contemplation, analyzing whatever knowledge a person has. So Gautam Buddha must have organized all his views, all his thought processes, identified the basic human problems, found out logical solution to them, formulated the way in which he could take action on all of them, the organization that he needed to build, the way he needed to preach to all of them. And he must have become aware of his own potential to carry out all this as a master to alleviate the suffering of the common man. This obviously is the Bodhi or the Bodh that he got. Buddha is the one who is enlightened, one who has acquired Bodhi. And so he left to preach. The first sermon that he carried out was at a place called Sarnath, and the sermon was delivered in a language which is Prakrut, common man's language, and the pattern that he chose is known as Pali. There were many others, Ardhamagadi and Shauraseni and others. The one that he chose was Pali. And this first sermon is another major threshold in Buddhism. It is known as, the original word is Dharma Chakra Pravartan, but it is often in Pali pronounced as Dhamma Chakra Pravartan. Let's talk of the original word, as I said. There are a lot of stories and fables attached to what happened in this first sermon, of thousands of gods and others witnessing from above and all that. Let's keep all that aside right now. His early disciples are said to have included his 2 teachers and his 4 co-students that were along with him. And he then travelled extensively for the next 40 years, covering the length and breadth of the whole region. In the process of his sermons and teachings, he acquired very good disciples like Anand, Upali, Mahakashyapa and many others, Mahamoggalayan and so forth. They were all extremely learned and knowledgeable people. The ones who were convinced of his teachings, who understood what he really meant and followed him wholeheartedly throughout their lives. The ones who could take up the responsibilities of the Sangha, the order that he established, and hold the Sangha together after he passed away. Along with them and many other students, numbering about 400, 500 who travelled with him all along, Gautam Buddha preached throughout Magadha, Anga, Kosal, Kalinga, Rajagruha, Vaishali, and preached the maximum at a place called Shravasti. At this time, the king Ajatashatru was in power, and there were many other kings also who followed his teachings. Later on, much later after him, there were kings like Ashok, Kanishka, who offered a lot of patronage to him, right up to the time of Harshavardhan. The Sangha was the big order that was decided and made for the people who wanted to follow him and remain dedicated to working and preaching along with him. There were a lot of rules for this. I'll go into details next time related to this. But there are some issues that we must mention here. The Sangha was restricted to the men in the beginning, and after the insistence of Anand, his most favored disciple, he finally relented and said that okay, I would accept females to join the Sangha also. Prajapati Gautami, his aunt, was the first person to join as a female person inducted into the Sangha. Gautam Buddha himself was not really very happy about this. So his comment is very revealing at this time. He said, my religion would have lasted for 1,000 years. But now because of you, since I have added women to this, it might last for only about 500 years. We realize today that it has survived and flourished for more than 2,500 years and still going very strong. The time he was born was Vaishak Purnima. The time he got enlightened, that is got Bodhi, was again Vaishak Purnima. And the time he passed away was also Vaishak Purnima. So for the Buddhist, this is one of the most important dates in their calendar. How he passed away is mentioned in at a lot of places. The Mahat Parinirvana Sukta, which is in the Dirgha Nikaya, is the one that talks of how he passed away. He was at the ripe age of 80, traveling around. He was at Rajagruha, where he fell sick, and he decided to move to Vaishali, where he tried to convalesce for some time. But then again decided to go on and move forward and traveled along with his students to Pava. Then stayed in a Amravan, which is typically a mango park, and there one of the disciples of that area, who was either a blacksmith or a goldsmith, who offered food for him. This was at a place called Kushinara, or many a times referred to as Kushinagara. He was offered sweetened rice and maddav, which is probably pork, and it did not suit him quite well because his stomach was very upset and he had extensive stomach problems. And it is here that he realized that it was time that he would pass away. This is typically referred to as Mahaparinirvana. It is at this stage that he got his students together and still continued preaching, gave them the best of possible advice till the last minute, till he passed away. A man dedicated for the upliftment of the society, something that we all Indians are extremely proud of. A man who has enlightened thousands and thousands and thousands of people throughout his life and millions today. We can see Gautam Buddha's achievements in some broad steps. He identified the social, cultural and religious problems of the common man. He analyzed them to the best of his own ability and came to it through serious contemplation and meditation. He put forward the causes, then provided simple solutions which were affordable to the common man. He then preached and had dedicated disciples. He established a very strong order known as the Sangha. He put forward the working principles, the do's and the don'ts, the rules and the laws for the Sangha. And he personally preached for a span of 40 years. And that's a big time. Even Jesus got about 10 to 12 years to preach. And when we talk of Islam, we find that Muhammad had a time span of around 20 years at the most to personally preach and have contact with his disciples. Mahavir had a span of around 30 years. Gautam Buddha was the one whose blessings and teachings were available to all his students for a span of 40 years. He was the Buddha, the most educated. He is known as Tathagata. It refers to the path followed by the Great One. He is the one who preached till his last date. But there are some aspects that are misinterpreted many a times. Many a times Brahmanism, sacrifices, ritualisms, a caste system is blamed for the rise of Buddhism. But if you look at his teachings, the 4 Arya Satyas, the Ashtanga Marg that he has put forward, the Triratnas that he has put forward, the Panchashil that he has mentioned, the Pratitya Samutpad that he has taught, none of these have any references to the ill effects of Brahmanism or the drawbacks in Vedic philosophies. He did not appreciate many of the ideas in Vedic philosophy, but there is no reference to any of them in his major ideas that he has put forward. So it is quite likely that many of his interpretations during his discussions have been made in a different manner because of the stress that was developed between the Vedic philosophies and the Buddhist philosophies later on. Because many of the ideas that he preached were also part and parcel of what is there in the Upanishads. What he did was to bring all this knowledge in an extremely efficient way to the common man. He must have gained a lot of maturity over the span of 40 years, and so his preachings must have improved in all this span of 40 years. All the places related to his life are the major pilgrimage sites. His birth at Lumbini, the Bodhi that he got at Gaya, which is Bodh Gaya, his first sermon, which is at Sarnath, and his Mahaparinirvana, the time he passed away at Kushinagar. All these are sites visited by Buddhists throughout their possible time spans. Buddha has contributed a lot to the world. He has made religion very simple, and his teachings deal with some of the aspects that I mentioned just some time back. It is these that we will concentrate on and understand his teachings next time when we meet. If you have liked whatever I have said, if you appreciate whatever I have said, please pass it on to your friends. Like and subscribe to this channel. Do give me your comments. The views that I have expressed are associated with a lot of information from a variety of texts. These have nothing to do with the original Buddhist texts, because there could be a different view sometimes expressed. Please understand the logic behind whatever I have said. Till we meet again, to understand his actual teachings and understand what a person who is referred to as a Mahamanav, the Great One. Let us meet and understand his teachings next time. Till then, Namaskar.